My name is Aubrey Hendrick, the hostess of Tales from the Round Table, and this is the podcast for anyone curious about the history behind the legends of King Arthur, the people who wrote them, and what those stories can still tell us today. Welcome to the table.
Episode 6, Appreciate, Appropriate, and Arthuriate. Part 5, Diaspora. We are so close to finishing this series, y'all. This is the second to last episode of this 6-part series examining the growth and change of the King Arthur character from its inception to the present. Looking at what roles Arthur fills and what this says about the people who initially wrote and heard these tales. Today, we are going to explore some texts that are not French, English, or Welsh. That's right, we're finally digging into King Arthur tales across Europe, so buckle in. A quick table of contents. We're going to start with 2 quick disclaimers, then present an overview, as much as I can, of Arthuriana outside of Britain and France. Then we'll look at a German source and a Dutch source, and wrap up, as always, with how and why Arthur's character was changed, and what this tells us about the character of Arthur and the people who would have heard these tales. So, the disclaimers. What we are talking about today predominantly happened in the 13th century. What we talked about last episode, Thomas Malory, didn't happen until the 15th century. I did this on purpose to keep the things happening in Britain close together so you could see the evolution in Britain more clearly. The next disclaimer. Throughout this series, I've tried to give you a picture of what's going on in the world. My goal is to help you understand how people's cultures shaped the stories that they told. I'm going to try to do that in this episode also, but Europe is big and consists of lots of different cultures. There are many different Arthur stories from many different countries. We're only going to talk about 2 texts in depth. In the future, I might do a series discussing different countries' respective contributions to Arthuriana, but since the goal of this particular series is to show you where we started and how we got to the version of Arthur that we have today, I'm going to be extremely brief. Let me try to explain the state of Arthuriana in medieval Europe. Most of these stories, like Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, Chrétien de Troyes' The Knight of the Cart, and Thomas Malory's La Morte d'Arthur, were wildly popular during their own time. Even though they started out localized, they were carried throughout Europe by merchants, soldiers, or even monks and common people. There are 2 big reasons for this. The first, for the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire, you have the spark of globalization. Most people in the Middle Ages never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. And that's being generous. You were born in the same town, you lived in the same town, and you had the same job and worked the same land as your father and grandfather. This is true even of the noble class. Travel is expensive and dangerous. So, what changed? The Crusades. To be clear, the Crusades are not good. However, one of the things that came out of the Crusades during the 11th through 13th centuries is that for the first time in hundreds of years, you have large groups of people traveling hundreds of miles from where they were born and experiencing wildly different cultures. Not only are knights from England and France being introduced to new cultures, but they're also introducing Arthuriana to new cultures. The second reason Arthur stories spread so quickly is the Angevin court. The Angevins ruled most of Britain and France for most of the 12th and 13th centuries, And they consist of some famous historical figures you've probably heard of, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard the Lionheart, and even Prince John of Robin Hood fame. Because of the Angevins' involvement with the Crusades, their position as rulers of England and France, and their willingness to foster cultural exchange, we now have Arthurian stories traveling like wildfire across Europe. Hang on to the Angevins, because we're going to touch on them again. Every single country that encounters Arthur adapts and recontextualizes the matter of Britain to make it relevant to them. For example, Icelanders fell in love with Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae and translated it into Old Norse. They liked histories in general, and, Arthur's war mania, boldness against the Romans, and fights with giants aligned wonderfully with their own Viking culture and played a large role in Iceland's transition from being a predominantly oral culture to a written one. Hakon Hakonarson, the king of Iceland from 1217 to 1263, facilitated a lot of trade with England. Also, I don't actually know how to say his name. I don't speak Icelandic, so I'm sorry if I killed it. He received many Arthur stories, and those stories became an integral part of the Icelandic cultural renaissance, birthing what scholars today call the classical age of Icelandic literature. On the complete opposite end of Europe, you have the Italians also falling in love with Arthur. In Italy in the 13th and 14th century, you have Arthur stories circulating in Latin, French, Greek, and even Hebrew, believe it or not. Tristan is the favorite knight of the Italians, and there are many different stories and versions in the Italian peninsula, even a full cycle retelling of the matter of Britain, all revolving around Tristan. But it is not Italy or Iceland that we are going to explore today. Instead, we are going to discuss two texts from the middle of Europe. And the first is by a man named Wolfram von Eschenbach, the epic German poem Parzival. Wolfram von Eschenbach was a German Bavarian knight who lived from circa 1170 to circa 1220. Scholars believe he was born in Eschenbach bei Ansbach, Franconia, in modern-day Germany. Pardon my German. He was a member of the lesser nobility and therefore was not wealthy. However, he served various Franconian lords, and from what we know of him, he seemed to be a pretty happy dude overall. He is frequently called the greatest German medieval poet, and Parzival, written in Middle High German, is known as one of the greatest literary works of the Middle Ages. Wolfram claims to be adapting Parzival from two sources. The first is Chrétien de Troyes' unfinished poem, Percival, or The Story of the Grail, which Chrétien himself claims he adapted from a book given to him by Count Philip of Flanders. Wolfram's second source, Kjot of Provencal, is debatable. We don't know if Kjot was a real person. Some scholars believe that he and his version of Percival were real and were just lost to time, while others claim that Kjot is Wolfram's invention to give him an excuse to change things he didn't like in Chrétien. Wolfram makes a big deal continuously about how faithful he is to Chrétien, except when he's following Kjot. So either he's saying that to give himself more credence while he does whatever he wants, or he's trying to reassure us that he's really not making things up. I could see either argument being true. Parzival itself is long. We are not even scratching the surface of this bad boy. It's 16 books and over 24,000 lines of poetry. I died reading this text, so you really had better enjoy this. It follows the title character, Parzival, as he adventures and learns how to be a knight. It opens with his father, Gamurret, who falls in love with and marries two separate women at the same time. Gamurret is killed in battle, and Parzival's mother, Herzeleid, Gamurret's wife number 2,
is so distraught that she flees her kingdom and raises Parzival in the forest. That way, he can never grow up to become a knight. This backfires when Parzival leaves home and becomes a knight anyway. He makes a lot of stupid decisions along the way, like accidentally making a woman think he's going to assault her, killing his cousin, getting married, and then running out on his wife, and failing to complete the Grail quest. However, he slowly but surely realizes the bad, selfish decisions he's made. He apologizes to the woman he scared and makes it right with her and her husband, and he dedicates his life to finding the Holy Grail and returning to his wife, both of which he does and becomes extremely happy. The poem also follows Gawain as the secondary protagonist. My favorite of his adventures is found in Book 7, Obi-Lot, when he saves a city under siege because its 8-year-old princess asks him to. It is literally the cutest thing and the best part of the entire poem by far. Gawain then goes on to fall in love with a woman named Orgalace, who is radically not interested in him, but beside the point to Gawain, I guess. He eventually defeats Orgalace's enemies and marries her, also ending the poem happy. There are so many things we could talk about in this poem, but we're only going to stick to 2. The first is that this is a Bildungsroman, meaning it tells the story of Parzival's coming of age. Parzival has to learn to think about his actions and what it means to be a knight. At first, he thinks being a knight is about fighting, winning, and getting what he wants. But by the end of the story, he realizes that people are counting on him to complete the Grail quest, and he needs to get his act together if he intends to do that. He also realizes that he loves his wife, Condwirimer, and he decides that he's going to return to her, be faithful to her, and treat her right, unlike every other character in this book with their respective wives. For such sorrow she well repaid him, Condwirimer, his wife, nor elsewhere had he sought love's solace in payment for love's fierce strife, though many their love had proffered. Parzival is literally the only character in the story who doesn't have an affair. He is faithful to Condwirimer, and he returns to her and really does try to be a good husband. Even though he did a lot of stupid things, and I don't super love this poem, that's definitely points in Parzival's favor. The second thing we're going to discuss about this poem is the character of Firefist Angevin. Why, you ask? Not only is he cool, but Firefist is Arthuriana's very first Black Knight. Firefist is Parzival's half-brother through their father, Gamurit. His mother is an African queen named Velcane, Gamurit's wife number 1. Firefist is literally half black and half white. His skin is both light and dark. He is also unique because he is not a Christian. He does eventually convert at the very end of the poem, but the story goes out of its way to note that Firefist is a pagan, while also highlighting how he's a good man and a very good knight. He is extremely courteous to everyone he meets. All the Christian characters, which is basically everyone else, only have positive things to say about him, and he is one of the best fighters. He also is the only person to defeat Parzival in combat. Then out he spake, the heathen, of such strife have I little fear, for e'en were my body naked, my sword I still hold it here. Of a sooth must thou be the vanquished, for since broken shall be thy sword, what availeth thy skill in combat keen death from thine heart to ward, unless of free will I spare thee? Firefist breaks Parzival's sword and then has Parzival at his mercy, and then chivalrously ends the fight since Parzival cannot fight back. Firefist, who is black and a pagan, defeats the white Christian hero and chooses to show mercy. Not only that, but Firefist's family name is Angevin. Remember the royal family and dynasty we talked about earlier? The royal family that was very powerful during this time period in England and France?
Yeah, the Angevins. I told you they were going to be important. Firefist is associated with a real, very powerful royal family. Pretty interesting, don't you think? This is a great place to transition to the second work we're going to discuss in this episode, Morian. Why, you ask? Because the main character of Morian is a man by the same name, and Morian, my friends, is also black. This anonymous work, also written in the 13th century, is in Middle Dutch and comes from the Netherlands. Morian is the son of an unnamed African princess and Aglovale, one of Arthur's knights. Aglovale met the princess while on a quest and promised to marry her, and then abandoned her, like everyone in Parzival. Morian is searching for Aglovale to force him to come back and marry his mother, thus saving her from shame. While searching for Aglovale, he encounters Lancelot and Gawain and adventures with them. Unfortunately, everyone he encounters in Europe is scared of him because he is black. However, he pushes through this, performs many brave feats, including rescuing Gawain, and eventually finds Aglovale. He then proceeds to go on a 2-page rant about what a sorry excuse for a father and husband Aglovale is for running out on his mother. It's beautiful and so deserved. Aglovale apologizes and returns to marry Morian's mother, with Lancelot and Gawain tagging along to celebrate the wedding. Thus, Morian accomplishes his mission, is recognized by the 2 greatest knights of Arthur's court as being a wonderful person and a great warrior, and they all live happily ever after. A lot of scholars think the character of Morian was inspired by Firefist, who is believed to have been written first. They have a lot in common. They're both half African, abandoned by their fathers, and phenomenal knights. The only difference is that Morian is entirely dark and he is a Christian, while Firefist's skin is half white and he is a pagan for most of the story. Unfortunately, they also both experience a lot of fear and discrimination from others due to their skin color. When they beheld Morian, they were altogether in fear of him, since he was so tall and black withal. Morian develops a close friendship with Gawain. Throughout the story, Gawain is consistently referred to as the father of adventure. He is given far more screen time than Lancelot and is held up as the pinnacle of knighthood. But Gawain ends up in a sticky situation when he's captured. Sir Gawain sat by the wayside in sorry plight, with his hands bound, but the good knight Morian so drave aback the folk who had brought Gawain thither. He defended Gawain so well with his mighty blows that none might come at him to harm him. Gawain thanked God and Morian 100-fold that he was thus delivered from peril and comforted in his need. Gawain, the father of adventure, is rescued by Morian. Morian proves to be as great a knight as Lancelot and Gawain, arguably an even better one, so much so that Gawain himself says that he was one of the best knights the sun ever shone upon. For a newcomer in Arthuriana to be referred to in that way by Gawain, that's a big deal. So, we have not touched on this subject really at all, but what does this say about the character of Arthur? Well, Arthur is in both Parzival and Morian. However, he plays really minor roles. He's shown to be an intelligent, just, and wise ruler, but he takes a major backseat to everyone else, if you can't tell from the fact I haven't mentioned him at all. This indicates how, as Arthur's stories spread throughout Europe and the rest of the world, Arthur drifted into the background more and more as new characters were brought in. It's like what we talked about in episode 3. People didn't see themselves in the stories that existed, so they created new stories and new characters. Arthur isn't a prominent character anymore, but he is still an important part of the world that gives the new characters credence. He acts as the central glue tying all of the disparate characters and stories together. Finally, As always, what does this tell us about the people who would have written and heard these tales for the first time? Well, it tells us three things. Firstly, just like the Gawain poet and Thomas Malory, Wolfram von Eschenbach was very interested in what it means to be a good knight. Arthur is noble and makes consistently good decisions, and Parzival learns to think about other people. Wolfram was trying to show how Parzival and Condwiramer, the only couple that honors each other, saves themselves for marriage, and doesn't have affairs, were actually the happiest, and thus Parzival is the best knight. I'm going to be honest with you. I couldn't stand this work. Maybe that was a translation issue. The translation I read was horrible. And reading over 24,000 lines of a horribly translated poem will make anyone dislike it. The men in this work go through wives the way James Bond goes through Bond girls. And there's only so much of it I can take. I know I talk a lot here and in my emails about how most of these Arthurian works are usually very progressive for when they're written, but this one killed me. It would take a full episode to discuss my issues with it, and ain't nobody got time for that. At least not right now. Secondly, we can see the evolution of other characters outside of Arthur. In both Parzival and Morian, Gawain is the secondary protagonist. Lancelot is an important character in Morian, but he is sort of glossed over and his story isn't given nearly the same attention as Gawain. While in Parzival, he is only mentioned and never makes an actual appearance. Through this, we can see how Gawain was the more popular, much older character, while Lancelot is a much newer addition to Arthuriana who took time to catch people's interests outside of the French. Finally, we see, for the first time, characters showing up in Arthuriana who aren't white. And both of them, Firefist and Morian, are presented as just as capable, strong, and chivalrous as everyone else, if not even more so. So many people claim that Arthuriana exists for white men. And that is hornswoggle. Like, bro, read the stories for yourself. As we talked about in episode 3 earlier in the series, there is medieval Arthuriana being written by women. Lancelot himself was probably invented by a woman. Not only that, but you have medieval Arthuriana featuring Black characters in an extremely positive light. It's true that the Black characters do face a lot of, fear regarding their appearance, which is absolutely not right. And that's not something that anyone should have to face. And it's something that the characters have to power through and overcome. However, I hesitate majorly to say that either Firefist or Morian experience racism. Racism is thinking one race is better than another, mistreating someone, or in general defining someone based on their race. I cannot stand it when people say this is an example of racism. When characters react to Firefist and Morian in fear because of their skin tone, you have to remember these medieval peasants have literally never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. They don't know anyone who has, and they cannot read. It never occurred to them that there were other skin tones outside of being pale. And they are superstitious people who believe in fairies, okay? Of course they're going to freak out. It doesn't mean that it's okay, but it does mean we need to understand why they're doing it. If either of these works, Parzival or Morian, were trying to prove something about how one race is better than another, they wouldn't have had Firefist be better than the main character, Parzival himself, and they wouldn't have had Morian rescue the father of adventure, Gawain, and tell off his white father about abandoning his mom. So many modern authors and retellings are like, oh, this exists just for white men. It's so elitist. And I'm like, no, there were plenty of epic African knights and strong women. You just didn't include them in your retelling.
I think it's really neat to see how cultures blended together to create new characters and new plot lines. Like I said earlier, the Crusades were not great, and they were something that should have never happened. They were flat out wrong, okay? But something good that came out of them is that people encountered new cultures and their worlds and worldviews got bigger. These stories continue what we've talked about so frequently on this podcast. People don't just exist for us. These stories are still so impactful to us today because they show us that the best thing we can try to do is keep an open mind and think about others above ourselves. Like Parzival, we need to think about how our actions impact others and make conscious decisions to grow and change. And when others' decisions negatively impact us, like with Firefist and Morian, we can still choose to power through, do the right thing, and take responsibility for our own lives. To kind of sum it all up, let me wrap up this episode by quoting Melek Artus, a 13th century Hebrew Arthur story. It is possible to learn wisdom and ethics from these fables concerning a man's conduct towards himself and his fellow man. Therefore, they are neither idle nor profane talk. I'm Aubrey Hendrick, and you've been listening to Tales from the Round Table. See you again in a couple weeks. Thanks so much for hopping in and listening to my podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me on the Contact Me page of my website, aubreyhendrick.com. On my website, you can also find my notes and research for this episode, which is particularly long for this episode. I mentioned earlier, I send out weekly emails that talk about all things Arthur and continue the conversation that we have here. So if that's something you'd be interested in, you can sign up on my website as well. I want to give a huge shout out to Professor Noah Peterson of Texas A&M University. He gave me tons of help as I compiled my research. This episode would not have happened without him, as this is a very understudied area of Arthuriana. So thank you so much, Professor Peterson. Well, that's it for me, y'all. See you again in a couple weeks.